Today we're talking about the glitz and the glamour of the Silver Age in Russian art, sex, drugs, and a lot of poetry. When we talk about the Silver Age in Russian art, it encompasses a lot of things. Literature, yes, but the themes and the moods that we're going to be talking about today were also affecting music, visual mediums, theater. But to be fair, when we say the Silver Age, we're most likely talking about literature and poetry in specific. People living during that period obviously didn't know that they were living in the Silver Age. There was already a golden age defined, that was the early 19th century with Alexander Pushkin leading the charge, and so the poets that followed obviously look up to him and took after him, so they would normally call their time the Second Golden Age. Both of these terms, Golden and Silver Age, obviously call back to the ancient Greeks, Hesiod and Ovid in specific, and I will not rehash their ages of men theory here, but the thing to keep in mind is the Silver Age that came after the Golden Age was a time of certain decay. We will leave that later. There is some discussion as to who first coined the term for that particular period in Russian art history. Most reference a late poem by Anna Akhmatova, A Poem Without a Hero, where she reflects on that period in her life. And the silver moon was cooling over the Silver Age. This is as good of an explanation as any, so we'll stick to it. What period are we talking about then? Well, there is some debate over the specific dates, as it always is, but the most universally accepted time frame is that the Silver Age started 1894 with the publication of a collection of poems, Russian Symbolism by Valery Brusov, and ended either 1921 with Alexander Blok's death or 1931 with Mayakovsky's. As you can see, a very short period of about 30 years, but what 30 years were those? In order to understand the literature of the time period, we need to look at the historical context. And we can look rather broadly here, because Russian history at the time was very much interconnected with the European one, even if it was slightly behind it. All of the authors that we're going to be talking about today, they read the philosophical books of the time period, they traveled to Europe on the regular, and realistically, the historical events up to October Revolution were world events, like World War I. So what was happening? Well, the turn of the century was viewed by many as this frontier between the old dying world and the new one that is yet to be born. There were some things that changed in the 19th century that put into question things that were never questioned before. Technology developed at an alarming rate. The agrarian lifestyle was being replaced by an urban one. And for those not working exhausting 12-hour shifts, there were philosophical changes of it too. Darwin in his theory put the religious roots of creation into question. Marx offered a different option for the system that underpins all of our interactions, i.e. capitalism versus socialism, and Nietzsche boldly proclaimed that God is dead, among other things. And with no hard truths really left, it created this air of futility in the air, of decay, like nothing matters, at least not the things that used to. There was a strong push for something new, something unseen before, that would answer these anxieties of the end of the world and meaningless of it all. If God is dead, what does that mean? If we're just blobs of flesh on this rock that we call home, what is the purpose for it then? In culture, the two answers that stuck were modernism and the decadent movement. These broad subjects are not my specialty area, so we'll look at them with the broadest lens possible and try to zoom in at what was actually important for the Russian decadence. Modernism at its core is built on contrarianism, renouncing what came before and creating something unseen before. And thus modernism comes in many shapes and sizes, especially in the early stages of it. It involves a lot of experimentation, some successful, some less so. And because it is built on renouncement of realism in many ways, it becomes contrarian, provocative even. And then you add the layer of the decadent movement that itself was built on the desire to break the restricting rules in art, and that adds a flavor of certain doom and gloom and decay that comes from those fin du siècle staples such as ennui, cynicism, and pessimism. But the decay of the decadence is sexy decay. It's all about submitting to your desires, the subversion of morality, about provocations, living your life loudly. Or at least that's the parts that Russian poets picked out. Obviously, the French decadent movement and symbolism came first, so the Russian poets had a chance to see what that was and then rework it into something that they liked here on Russian soil. The thing to keep in mind is that Russian art got stuck in the realism stage for a very long time, in literature starting from the 1830s up until the end of the century, but in other art forms as well. While Europe was already embracing Impressionists, Russian передвижники only managed to draw a realistic Russian field, and that was already considered a protest. So Russian art scene was primed for a change, any change, and the modernists went all out. So what was modernism and the decadent movement for the Russian poets at the turn of the century? First of all, Russians, more than many, felt this foreboding of the dark times ahead. Yes, you could say that we only see that with the benefit of hindsight, and maybe that's true to a degree, but this feeling of end is nigh, the decay, the desperation, depression, and death are in many poems of that period. That is all fed by the same moods that were prevalent in Europe with the modernists and the decadents, but also like Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, and co. When nothing is certain, then everything becomes relative. Good and evil, God and devil, love and the physical manifestation of it. So art starts pushing those boundaries. If God isn't listening, maybe the devil will. What is love? This is the feeling that I feel, or the physical manifestation of it. How far can I push the morals before we break? And even if we do, what does that matter if we're all going to die anyways? We're cursed by knowing that we got more than one path at stake. We're blessed in that it matters not which one of two to take. And so these feelings of instability in anything and everything, the doom and gloom, this feeling of upcoming death become the mood. And the outward manifestation of it, the Russian bohème, also took from the French, specifically from the decadent movement and from avant-garde. We talk a lot about art and artists, how the artist's life affects their art, but normally death of the author still applies, and more importantly for realists, their creation and their work exist separately from their lives as individuals. For Russian decadents and modernists, on the other hand, life and art become inseparable. There is no more separation between art and artist. You needed to live your life as an art form. But while regular life can provide some source for art, it's likely not going to be enough. So these artists needed to push themselves further. And so a lot of their actions became artistic expressions almost, something that we here call épatage, a French word, but we've coined it. Essentially intentionally provocative behavior, shocking and challenging. A tame example would be this picture of Valery Brusov, who, when asked how he wanted his picture taken, decided to climb under the table. On a more extreme end of the spectrum, it would be something like inventing a new religion with blood rituals by Zinaida Hippius and Dmitry Merezhkovsky. But these provocations can only work if these artists live their lives loudly and with an audience. The poets were the social elite. Today we would compare them to like influencers or simply celebrities. Didn't we go in the wrong direction if the poets used to be the social elite and now it's the social media influencers? Today, you can run into an influencer in the street or go to a meet and greet and pay like $100 for a picture with them. And weirdly, 100 years ago, the mechanics were kind of similar. There was a famous location in St. Petersburg, a pub/cabaret, the Stray Dog, where all of these poets used to hang out. If you were known as the poet, then you would pay like 5 rubles for entry. But if you were nobody, a merchant or petit bourgeoisie who simply wanted to meet this poet, you got charged 50 rubles. And the pub was packed every night. It was the hub for the art scene and for the social scene too. You as a viewer could see all of these poets interact, drink, squabble, and obviously hear them read their own poetry. Or if you're lucky, maybe Mayakovsky would break a glass on your head as part of his performance, who knows? But then there is also a side effect to the provocative behavior, that it feeds on deviation. Alcohol, drugs, deviant sexual behaviors were rampant at the time. All of these poets were alcoholics, some high-functioning, some less so. Alexander Blok was famous for his pub crawls. He would hate every establishment in St. Petersburg that served booze and treat a shot at each one until he'd pass out somewhere. And we're talking really seedy places here. Drugs were also rampant, opioids mostly, but like coke used to be sold at pharmacies. They didn't know yet how bad it is for you, and it is bad, don't do drugs. Like, Brusov was famously addicted to morphine, for example. Am I gonna be able to open this or not? As a side effect of this godlessness that they found, there was also this obsession with the occult. It manifested in literature, actually. There's no other period in Russian literature where a devil appears so many times. But it was also manifesting in real life too, because they were obsessed with performing seances and various occult rituals. And then there is also love and sex. Yay! Russian Empire at the time was not that progressive. Divorces were not a thing. Homosexuality, I'm not sure it was criminalized, but at least it was very much tabooed. But this bohème was ripe for sexual scandals. It's not that bad, but like for non-alcoholic sparkling, yeah, I guess that's fun. Since the divorce was so hard to get, some folks simply just didn't get it and just lived with their new partners. Love triangles and cheating were rampant. Famously, Alexander Blok married Nadezhda Mendeleyeva, Dmitry Mendeleyev's daughter, the periodic table, that Mendeleev. And that union wasn't particularly happy. Blok denied her sex for a year after their marriage for reasons that we'll get to in a second, and so the poor woman fell for his friend and fellow writer Andrei Bely. Conversely, Bely was also in a love triangle with Valery Brusov and his wife, and not only does Bely not look like a Don Juan type, but also by the looks of it, he was assaulting these women, like befriending them first and then pouncing on them, so yeah, there is that. But love triangles are one thing, but then there were also polycules. The most famous one is probably Vladimir Mayakovsky and the Bricks, Lily and Osia, but also my absolute personal favorites are Zinaida Gippius and Dmitry Merezhkovsky. That's them with their third Dmitry Philosoph. Follow the logic here. Gippius is a gorgeous bisexual woman who dates both men and women, but mostly gay men because they're safe to fall in love with. Philosoph is that gay man that she's in love with, but he is only in this polycule for Merezhkovsky. Merezhkovsky is straight, so he's not into that, but he's also not attracted to Gippius. Their union is spiritual and not sexual. But then there is also the good old-fashioned cheating, like the power couple of the time, Nikolai Gumilev and Anna Akhmatova. He pursued her for a little while, she finally said yes, and when they went on their honeymoon to Paris, she instantly cheated on him there with an artist, Amadeo Modigliani. Family life never really worked out for these poets. They also had really troubling relationships with their children. Marina Tsvetaeva catches a lot of flack for her treatment of her youngest daughter these days, and with good reason. But even Anna Akhmatova, her only son with Gumilev, Lev, who then later turned into a great historian actually, he had a very strained relationship with her. There is a lot of discussion of the artist's personal life these days, a lot of moralizing and trying to pass judgment and attach it to their art. And yes, in some sense, they asked for it with their life as art mentality. But not only does the messiness of their life not detract from their art, but maybe it was kind of needed. Maybe you need to push yourself to such an extreme to create something truly powerful. Maybe Blok needed to frequent the seediest of bars possible to write The Stranger. Maybe Mayakovsky needed to suffer under the rule of strong Lilia Brik to write the poems full of longing and pain. Maybe Akhmatova needed the multitudes of her lovers to write truly beautiful female love poetry. The Silver Age was really short because it fell on the time period that was full of grand historical events. 2 Russian revolutions, World War I, Russian Civil War, and these extraordinary people caught in the middle of it, with their grand passion for life that they had, burning brightly like the candles and them being burnt out just as quickly, or them being blown out. Gumilev was executed 1921, Blok died that same year. Esenin and Mayakovsky took their own lives 1925 and 31 respectively. The women lived a little bit longer, but Tsvetaeva still took her own life, and only Akhmatova lived a somewhat long and relatively happy life. But no other period in Russian history produced so many talented poets. Not even the Golden Age. Pushkin earned that title for that period almost single-handedly, and here we can count the number of really crazy talented poets by the dozens, and some maybe just as talented as the maître himself. So finally, let's talk about the poetry, really broadly here. As I said, the Silver Age started with the publication of a collection, Russian Symbolism, 1894, by Valery Brusov, his pals, and some unknown authors who, as it later turned out, were just Brusov under different pseudonyms. While there are some differences with the French symbolism, the core remains the same. It is conveying a message through symbols. It all goes back to Plato, as it often does, and his allegory of a cave. He imagined us as people sitting in a cave, tied down, facing the wall, and we only see the shadows on the wall of what's going on outside, and outside is the real world. The thought process was that the realists only translate the shadows on the wall, while the symbolists are actually trying to convey what's going on in the real world. for symbols again, but hey-ho. Brusov plays into that allegory in his poem creative work. Shades of not shipped up creations, slowly swaying at nightfall, look like patch imaginations over the enameled wall. There is a lot of discussion to be had over what Russian symbolism is, the minutiae that I'm not equipped to get into, especially in an overview video like this, so I will simply borrow researchers Igor Suchich's definition of a symbol. The symbol is a polysemous parable. A symbol is an image that, unlike an allegory, allows for several interpretations, and they are determined not only by the cultural context, but also by the individual intention of the author. There are two waves of Russian symbolists, the older generation and the younger one, and they understood symbolism slightly differently. The older generation, led by Valery Brusov and Dmitry Mayakovsky, also included such prominent names as Fyodor Sologub, Zinaida Hippius, and Konstantin Balmont. For them, symbolism was all hints and shades and hidden meanings that are meant to provoke a new emotion in the reader. The purpose of symbolism is to hypnotize the reader with a series of juxtaposed images, as it were, to evoke a certain mood in him. This is poetry in which two contents merge organically, not violently. Hidden abstraction and obvious beauty merge as easily and naturally as on a summer's morning the waters of a river harmoniously merge with sunlight. However, despite the hidden meaning of symbolic work, its immediate concrete content is always complete in itself. It has an independent existence in symbolic poetry, rich in shades. Yeah. In essence, they believed that the complexities of this new world that we talked about in the beginning and the new man and his psychology cannot be expressed with mere words. Like logic doesn't apply, symbols are needed for that. But the fun for them comes from the ambiguity of meaning. The famous monostage by Valery Brusov, O Carver Dagpal Feet, made quite a sensation when it first came out, not only for its provocative nature, but also because when asked about its meaning, Brusov gave a different answer every single time, ranging from somebody covering Jesus' feet at the cross to a prostitute closing her legs. And yes, there is a grain of sensationalism here, but really, it's all about allowing the reader to derive meaning themselves. For the younger generation of symbolists, mostly Alexander Blok and his friend and romantic rival Andrei Bely, symbols became more abstract. Let's look at Blok in greater detail as he's going to exemplify some of the trends in symbolists for us. There are 3 poems by Blok that I want to mention here. They kind of serve as the cornerstones of his poetry. First, The Street, the Lamp. A night, a street, a lamp, a drugstore, a meaningless and dismal light, a quarter-century outpost, it's all the same, no chance of flight. You'd die and rise anew begotten, all would repeat as ever might. The street, the icy rippled water, the store, the lamp, the lonely night. This is symbolism at its finest. The images, the light, the darkness, the symbols highlighting the deeper meaning, but also this underpinning mood of loneliness and hopelessness. How very decadent of him. I reread this poem last year and it hit me right where it hurts. I love it. But also you get this sense of decay that we started this video with, the dying of the old world and the birth of the new one. But maybe Blok doesn't have much hope for it, this new world. It's just another cycle in the samsara. The second poem is The Stranger, maybe sometimes translated as an unknown woman. And slowly moving through the drunken guests, without an escort, indiscreet, emitting perfumes and exquisite mists, she settles at the window seat. And her snug silks exude the ancient tales, and doleful plumes atop her hat cascade and twine over the wispy wail, in rings her narrow hands beset. And overwhelmed by strange proximity, I look beyond the dusky veil, and see the shore of charming verity and the charmed distance to prevail. This poem actually exemplifies a problem with women that the symbolists had. Under the influence of Vladimir Solovyov, they developed this view of women as these virtuous creatures, almost divine, this untouchable and ephemeral, beautiful and infallible. Not all women, obviously, but the idea was to find one and serve her as a knight would his lady in the fictionalized version of the medieval times. And this relationship with the divine woman is mostly asexual. You sing her your poems, Blok had a whole collection of them, you treat her with respect and dignity, but sex is that basic thing that you just don't do with her. But the reality is that women are not these idealized version of people that this man had in their heads. They are real people with wishes and desires, with a temper sometimes, and the conflicts arises. And that's at the root of some of the conflicts that Blok had with his own wife and why she turned to his friend. Blok denied her sex for a year while hitting all of the brothels in St. Petersburg. And this poem here, where hero meets this ethereal woman in the seediest of bar possible, is most likely a poetic recount of one of Blok's nights out, drinking himself under the table, and this beautiful unknown woman is also most likely based on a prostitute that he met there. The poem is beautiful, don't get me wrong, but that kind of puts the damper on that party a little bit. The Stranger is already a little bit of a deconstruction of the fair lady prototype that Blok wrote about a lot in his youth and that he moved away from, but this poem still exemplifies some of the staples of that particular cycle in Blok's life, if you will. And the third poem that we need to mention is one of his last ones, and that is The 12. This is a layer that I haven't touched on yet, and this is the poet's response to the Russian Revolution. Blok was one of the authors that supported the revolution. He was a Bolshevik. So this poem, The 12, is a pro-revolution poem. It tells the story of 12 red soldiers patrolling the streets when they encounter a woman of one of them on a date with another, so they open fire on them. They then march forward, being led by Jesus. So on they go, with sudden tread, behind them limps the hungry mongrel, and wrapped in wild snow at their head, carrying the flag blood red, soft-footed in a blizzard swell, invulnerable with bullets sliced, crowned with a crown of snowflake pearl, in wreath of white rose, ahead of them, Christ Jesus goes. And while the poem is pro-revolution, the support and the basis for it is rather idealized. Blok viewed the revolution in terms of getting rid of all of the vices of the old world and building a new one without flaws. And thus the system starts showing the cracks really quickly. That's something that we see with a lot of early Soviet writers, like Platonov, for example, the blasted expectations versus reality conundrum. Blok was fully behind the ideas of the revolution, but what it actually became in the reality might not have been what he wanted. But this disillusionment hides behind layers upon layers upon layers of symbolism. I'm doing a broad overview here, so I cannot dive really deeply, but this is what Blok's poetry is like. But returning from starving St. Petersburg of 1921 back to the OOs, the symbolists were the first to come on stage out of the modernists. But almost as a response to them, obfuscating meaning, came Acmeism. Acmeism, after the Greek word acme, the best age of men, remember they were living the second golden age after all, was created by the power couple of the time, Nikolai Gumilev and Akhmatova, and their mate Osip Mandelstam. In opposition to symbolism, they stood for clarity of meaning and language in poetry. One of the books that I read on the subject had this handy table that highlights the differences between symbolism and Acmeism. Symbolism, by the very nature, was very exclusive. You needed to be in the know to get it, and in a way, it held itself above its readers. Acmeism, on the other hand, embraces the reader. It wants you to understand. That also shifts the subject matters that the poets deal with back down to earth, or in Plato's analogy, back into the cave, I guess. Although I do not think they viewed it as such. But this theme of double world is everywhere with Acmeism. There is this real world that we live in and the high world of high emotions. The most illustrative poet of the time period is probably Anna Akhmatova, but an honorable mention goes to her former husband, Nikolai Gumilev, a very interesting figure himself. He was a World War I hero, he got medals and all. He was an explorer too, he traveled across Africa. There's a river that an Ethiopian king gifted to him, I think. And thus his poetry leans towards ballads. He talks of grand travels and heroes. With Gumilev, you will see more than many this exploration of Nietzsche's ideas of supremacy of the spirit over the body and of the Übermensch. Only serpents change their outward skin and permit their souls to grow and age. But alas, we men are not their kin. We discard our souls and not the cage. One of his best and last poems is The Lost Tramp. It highlights his fear and apprehension of the path that Russia ended up on, and it kind of foreshadowed his own fate. 1921, he was arrested for participating in a counter-revolutionary conspiracy, and he was executed. We don't even know where he's buried. One of the researchers that I listened to for this video believes that Gumilev was still developing as a poet, and this untimely and horrific death arrested him before he reached his full potential.
Forever my heart bleeds in gloom. It's painful for me to be alive. I never thought there would be room for love and grief to exist side by side.
I love this edition, by the way. This is a library copy. I need to find one for myself. I love it for some reason. But back to Anna Akhmatova. Akhmatova is one of the few authors of the Silver Age that lived a relatively long and happy life. She died 1966, age 76, so her work and art encompasses not only the Silver Age, some of her most famous pieces like Requiem were written later. I understand that her style changed a bit, but the fundamentals remain the same. She stood for Acmeism in the sense that poetry needed to be clear in its message and in its form. There are no attempts at tricking the reader. One of her strengths was using mundane and simple imagery and conveying a deeper message with it. Like a famous line from one of her poets is putting the wrong gloves in the wrong hands. And that already, like this image already translates an emotion to the reader. She picks an item, a detail, and imbues it with psychological meaning.
Her things are ordinary, not allegories, not symbols. A skirt, a moth, oysters, an umbrella. But with her, these simple, ordinary things become unforgettable because she imperiously made them subdue to the lyrics. What is, for example, a glove? Meanwhile, the whole of Russia remembers the glove that Akhmatova's rejected woman talks about, walking away from the one who pushed her away.
It cannot be left unacknowledged that on Russian poetry scene, Akhmatova was one of the first female poets, so that already gives her poetry a very distinctive voice. Thematically, she wrote a lot about love and lack thereof. As we remember, with modernists, life and art became inseparable, so a lot of her poetry is imbued with bits of her own biography that you might need a good commentary for to fully understand it, and like a good understanding of the art scene at the time. But you can also read it as it is poetry after all. Her style is basically describing a small scene, creating a short story, a micronovella in a poetic form. She talks a lot of unhappy love, of separation, of desperation that comes with it. Her heroine is passionate, she loves, she suffers, she sees the world with clarity unseen before.
I've learned to live now wisely and simply, to look to the sky praying upon my knees, and wander quietly outside each evening to beat the useless feeling of unease.
Another theme for Akhmatova is her love for her country and for her God. That's probably why she lived so long and stayed in Russia, actually, because once the time came for her to decide if she wanted to go into immigration, she's decided to stick in Russia because this was her homeland and she couldn't leave it. On a personal note, Akhmatova doesn't resonate with me thematically or stylistically, really. I tried to find a poem that I liked from her, maybe this one, although I don't love it.
The 21st Monday night, the outline of the capital in mist. It had to be some idler who contrived the happy fantasy that love exists. And from the laziness or acclamation, all believed him and moved along, awaiting dates and dreading separations and venting love in song. But the secrets revealed universally to the others and the silence upheld, I've stumbled on it inadvertently, and since then I've been rather unwell.
Before we move on to the next movement, and speaking of female poets, let's mention Marina Tsvetaeva. She didn't belong to any particular movement, but she was very much a Silver Age poet. I have a full video on her. It's not very good, I don't think, but it's out there. And next, kicking the door in, came the Futurists, led by Vladimir Mayakovsky. Futurism, as you can guess from future, proudly proclaimed that we need to do away with tradition, leave Pushkin behind and invent something new, abandon all tradition and look into the future. Out of all of Russian modernists, Futurists pushed poetry the furthest. Futurism is all about new forms, neologisms, new metric feet, sometimes abandoning basic grammar and spelling. Just look at the way Mayakovsky constructed his poems. We call it stairs, intentional indentation, his signature move. Very unique ideas, very avant-garde, and very much not for everyone. It's not even meant to be. It's provocative by nature. It's meant to antagonize the reader and the listener too, because it's supposed to evoke the emotion there and then. Thematically, Mayakovsky was all about grandness. He hated the mundane. Everything that he talked about needed to be worthy of it. I put on a jacket for him too. He took everything to the extreme, especially his love relationships, and that translated into his poetry. If you want to see what Mayakovsky was all about, look no further than his most famous piece, A Cloud in Trousers. It blends all of his themes together, and it also highlights his poetry style, his language, his meter, his tropes, etc. At the core, it's all a pathos of the fight, of denial, of destruction that is very typical for Futurism. Away with your love, away with your art, away with your system, and away with your religion are the full parts to the poem. The poem was also originally called The 13th Apostle, and Mayakovsky envisions himself as such, except his apostle stands against God. He stands against a lot of things, Mayakovsky. He's in constant conflict with himself, with people around him, with his love interests and such. So the overwhelming emotions in his poetry are most often anger, loneliness, and resentment. What normally attracts people to this particular poem is the Away with Your Love segment and this cry of unrequited love. Because Mayakovsky takes a rather simple story of a girl marrying somebody else and imbues it with so much greatness, so much magnitude that the god and his angels need to get involved, and not just the people and the firemen to squish his burning heart.
People sniff smells of burnt flesh. They herded them, shining ones, in helmets, no beetle crushes. Tell the fireman, climb gently up the burning heart. I myself. I'll roll out my tearing eyes like barrels. Let me lean against my ribs. I'll leap out, leap out, leap out, leap out. They crashed. You can't leap out of the heart.
This is Mayakovsky. Everything needs to be felt at the extreme, like feverish and almost mad and delirious. Cloud in Trousers is now dedicated to Lille Brick, although it wasn't written as such. A very strong and powerful woman who held Mayakovsky in a tight grip and fed into his obsession. She was very much aware of the effect that she had on him, and her treatment of him we would now call like an emotional roller coaster. Switching between love and indifference, causing Mayakovsky great pain and great happiness at different intervals. And that produced beautiful poetry full of kind of desperation and obsessive love. Most people these days agree that Lila must not have loved Mayakovsky all that much. She loved her husband Osia, who didn't love her back. And so she stuck with Mayakovsky, who desperately loved her. And so there's this throuple, like, oh my God. And another obvious and important layer to Mayakovsky is him as a poet of the revolution. Futurism in many ways anticipated the revolution, so Mayakovsky fully embraced it and the formation of the USSR. In contrast to Blok, who maybe was a little bit cautious of what the future holds, Mayakovsky is excited. He sees the future as a positive one. But not only that, but he also sees it as his duty to help out. He worked at the HQ, he painted the posters, wrote slogans and ads, and he wielded his pen in trying to promote the values of the new state. His poems are straight-up propaganda pieces.
Eat pineapples, chew foie gras. Your last day is coming, dumb bourgeois.
There are some tensions in Mayakovsky's relationship with Soviet state that we're not going to get into, but realistically, he was the ideal writer, or like ideal Soviet writer. He was promoting the values of the new state, carousing people to join in, and he was doing that in a very evocative manner. Mayakovsky is definitely not my author. However, it needs to be said that I can somewhat understand the appeal. As I was prepping for this video, I read some of his poetry here, and although I didn't like it all that much, there is an interesting quality to them that whenever I read any of it out loud, I fall into this cadence that is very motivational, propagandistic, like I'm standing over a crowd rallying them up for something. Part of it is the image of Mayakovsky that I have in my mind. He was a very tall, imposing man with a booming voice, but it is about the writing too. There is a rhythm to it that we would now call oratory. In a way, it merges them with music, but also, if you ever read Mayakovsky, look out for the ties to the visual art forms. He was a painter first too, so there are interesting ways that he uses colors within the poems, but also the way that he visually constructs his poems. Nothing is ever kind of accidental with him. And last came the Imaginists. Not all of the researchers like naming them as a group, because the only prominent author there is Sergei Esenin. Imaginists, as you can imagine from Imago image, put a lot of emphasis on creating an image, like painting a picture with words, but that picture does not necessarily have a lot of meaning or a message behind it. The idea was to create this image to evoke an emotion and not to deliver a message or tell a story. And arguably this meaningless might have been intentional, but by the looks of it, it is rooted in Esenin himself. Esenin, the youngest of his lot, came from a peasant family and did make it relatively big in poetry circles, but as a side effect of him coming onto the stage late and not fully formed, he spent all of his relatively short writing career looking for himself. One critic called him a poet without an ideology and a worldview, and that actually might be true. Esenin tried different costumes over the course of his life, and none seemed to reflect what he was at the core. Most famously, he tried to use his peasant background as an image to portray to the world, the poet of the peasants, of the Russian heartland, of the village and its people. The problem is that Esenin loved the country the way I love the country, as a concept, as an aesthetic. The image of a quiet village surrounded by greenery, with slightly crooked wooden houses, hefty women, and children running after geese has very little to do with the realities of Russian village full of hard labor, insects, and poverty. So Esenin was appealing to urban bourgeoisie who never had to work in a village but loved the aesthetics of that Russia. But this image of a peasant was inconvenient, so Esenin quickly exchanged the linen shirt for the tuxedo and a top hat. Zinaida Gipios instantly called him a poser for that. And yeah, he kind of was. The part of his biography that everybody loves to talk about is his marriage to Isidora Duncan, for whom, for a period of time, he became a trophy husband. Love that for her. Does any of it detract from his poetry? No, not at all. Esenin is a master of lyrical poetry. That's where his strength is, even when he's talking about fictional Russian village and birch trees. And yes, this rural Russia is at the center of his poetry, incredibly rich in descriptive metaphors, if you're into that sort of thing. The cadence of his poems is very calm and lyrical, while thematically and emotionally they are full of this sense of decay, because the Russia that he talks about, well, it was dying. When Esenin started writing about his urban lifestyle, that earned him the reputation of a hooligan. And then came his later poems. Very soon, Esenin felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He felt like he'd lived a dozen lifetimes. And so his later poems, especially during his last year of his life, he spent trying to understand himself, understand the psychological changes that he'd gone through, and inevitably saying goodbye to this world. Esenin is often compared to Mayakovsky. They were quarreling in real life too, and they actually represent the opposite sides of the spectrum. Esenin is the poet of the Russian village, Mayakovsky of the urban streets. Esenin is lyrical when Mayakovsky is full of ethos and pathos. Esenin looks into the past while Mayakovsky only sees the future. It is so curious that neither of them found the place in this new world that they welcomed, and both decided to end it themselves. And that is what Russian Silver Age was like. Born of the decadent movement and modernism, it produced a whole generation of poets, each with their own unique voice and tragic fate. I always feel weird recommending poetry to you because the quality of it is going to depend on the translator more than the original text sometimes. But if anything that I've talked about today caught your interest, do check them out. And I will exit with a final poem by Esenin.
Farewell, my friend. So long, my darling. Darling, you are here in my heart. Even so, this predestined parting will not keep us evermore apart. Farewell. No clasping and no crying, no scowling and no feeling blue. There is nothing new about dying, and to keep on living isn't new.